right. So last week I was down at TCO in Bryn Mawr, and I was giving a presentation talking about my crayfish fly and presenting the crayfish fly. And at the end of the presentation, one of the people sitting next to me watching me tie the fly said, "This is just such a departure from what I am doing down here lately with the really thin leaders and the fast sinking flies and getting the visual strike detection." And in my mind, there is an absolute separation between that style of fishing and the style of fishing that I like to do with these bigger flies, like a crayfish fly. And so I want to discuss this difference in styles of fishing for larger flies like a jig streamer or a big anchor like a crayfish, and fishing that well versus this classic European style of tight line nymphing that's gotten very fine and light and is a incredible tactic for catching the fish and for strike detection. But the stuff that I do, you can't really use the super fine leaders to cast around a big heavy fly like a crayfish. And so it's a different type of thing. And I'm going to describe that as drift nymphing as opposed to European nymphing, and talk about some of the ways that you can build a tapered leader and use the same nymphing rods and strike detection tactics to use a whole different style of rig to drift your flies through the water and use the current and a heavier style leader to move the flies through the water in harmony with the current as opposed to fighting the current with a tight line. So, Henry, what are your thoughts on the real fine nymphing leaders?
Yeah, I think the micro leaders are getting to the extreme. And yeah, it's almost uncomfortable fishing those in a way that you would kind of a traditional
How
nymphing sense.
how thin of line are you comfortable with in your hand?
In my hand,
Yeah.
I mean, I'd like to like a full mono. I don't want to have like a 6X all the way down to my hand.
So the thing that I'm going to describe that I'm going to call drift nymphing is going to use a 10 or 12 pound test as the line that's going to be what's in your hand when you're controlling a fly. It's going to help you turn a fly over and have more control of these larger flies like a crayfish fly or like a sculpin jig streamer, and also control the way that those sink into deeper water and move with the current, and how to get strike detection in deeper water, and also just how to understand the concept of building out a taper that's going to work for you on your waters with the size and weight flies that you use. So this is going to be drift nymphing, and that is going to be a different thing than European nymphing, which I think is just classified now as a finer, lighter, tighter contact thing. This style drift nymphing is going to be a semi-contact thing, and you're going to use the same rods, reels, and casts and strike detection that you would be using with that European nymphing, but you're going to use a heavier tapered line, and you're going to use flies that have a sink rate that's more like the natural sink rate of insects in the water, and flies that have a density and a buoyancy that's more like the natural sink rate in the water. And one fly that's out there right now that forces you to do this is the mop.
Mm.
The mop fly absorbs water, and it fishes in the water with a similar weight to the water, which is like similar to having a water balloon that's full of water that's out there in the water. Because a water balloon is heavy. If you had a water balloon on the end of your rod, you wouldn't be able to cast it. But the water balloon isn't going to sink like a stone. The water balloon is barely going to sink because the density of the water balloon is the same as that of the water. And what I really want to describe is how, when you have flies that they have a density that's more like the actual insect in the water, and how that gets moved around by the current is a much different thing than having something like a perdigon that is ultra dense and kind of defeats the current and allows for a different type of strike detection and fly control. Because when you go to something that's the size of a crayfish or a sculpin and you give it a density like a perdigon, the natural nature of the fly at the depths where the fish interact with it looks very unnatural. So we're going to talk about the difference between the density and the weight of the flies and how having flies that have weight but not that high density allows you to fish in a drift nymphing style as opposed to that tight European nymphing style. What kind of nymphs are in your box?
My box, I do have a fair amount of perdigons that I fish in that Euro nymphing style with a really tight contact line. But yeah, I do fish. Before I started Euro nymphing, was doing all indicator nymphing and used a more classic style bead head that's not tungsten and sinks with a more similar rate to a actual insect rather than plummeting through the water column.
When you're building a nymphing leader, are you building much of a taper into it?
I am, yeah. I like to have a bigger, like 10 to 15 pound in my hand. Um, just the comfortability of being able to manipulate that works well with me. And then, yeah, building it down, um, often back from my cider. I will go pretty thin depending on how spooky the fish are and time of year, but I don't like to go too thin, and I don't like to have, honestly, don't like to have too many knots under my cider. Just the more knots, the less comfortable I feel connected to a larger size fish on the end.
So the stuff that you're doing, I think, falls in between these two ranges
Yeah.
of what is that microliter style of Euro nymphing that I think that a lot of the market is moving towards. Everybody that I talk to really is moving thinner in the main line that they're using. It doesn't mean that everyone is using super thin line,
Hmm.
but everybody seems like the collective group of the nymph fishermen that are fishing with mono are getting comfortable using a lighter mono.
Yeah.
And I just want to make the argument for what the advantages are of using a heavier mono at times with the styles of flies that I think are often going to result in taking the largest, most difficult fish.
So Kelly Galloup has described the flies used for Euro style nymphing, that describing them not having soul, and that flies should have soul. How does this fall with your style and the patterns that you fish?
I think it's a really great comment, and I definitely feel like I understand where Kelly is coming from when I see flies that have a really dense sink rate and don't have any, legs or material coming off them. When it comes to the idea of tying the fly,
Hmm.
Kelly's a fly designer, and he has these great dynamic, streamers that, really push water and move in unique ways. And when you create flies and when you design flies and then you see flies that are just maybe an epoxy body, I think I can connect with that, being someone who also creates some really complex flies, of feeling like there's something to be said for having a fly that has parts and stuff coming off of it, and you've put tied materials and just such great materials and things that we have available today to create imitations of things. And so I do like to try to use flies that have moving parts and have natural sink rates. And the thing about flies that have moving parts is that the fish bite them with more enthusiasm. When things are like wiggling or twitching, I think fish will move around more to attack those flies and bite them a little bit harder. And that allows for more strike detection.
Hmm.
So when I'm going to be nymph fishing, I know that if I can use flies that the fish are really going to bite hard, I don't need to be as tight to my fly and leader to be able to detect the strike.
Hmm.
And that's a big difference in how flexible you can be using a semi-tight
Yeah.
leader as opposed to being really tight with it. And you can fish a lot farther away and you can detect strikes in a lot of different environments of depth and current and different parts of the water column when fish are really attacking the fly. And that's part of the drift style nymphing, where you're using a tapered build, where you're intentionally using the the hydrodynamics of the current to move your fly around in a natural way, and creating and using flies that have realistic sink rates of moving through the water the way a real food item would, and not having such a density that you're controlling them on a tight line in an unnatural way, which for a lot of things is a very effective way of fishing. However, I think there's something to be said for uh, using things that are flowing and move
Mhm.
around in the water, and having the taper and being able to tie and adjust your taper to drift things through the water in a way that I think is, for me, it's more compelling fishing
Yeah.
when I am in control of how my fly drifts with the current, and it's more dynamic in terms of all the different environments and depths and different types of fishing and different types of fish even that I can target with that type of with those tapered mono rigs to drift for things like walleyes, carp, smallmouth bass, fall fish.
You describe it as being half tight with your contact and your tension. What does that really look like? Do you have a bow in your line, or are you just loosely connected to the fly? What does that look like or feel like?
It's a tough question because depending on the different environments where you are fishing, and depending on what the fly is and the
Yeah.
way that the certain thing that you're fishing for bites the fly, the way that you set up to get strike detection is going to be different. So for something, for wild brown trout, if they're really keyed up to feed and you have good conditions and they're right up at, doesn't matter where they are, you need quick strike detection when the trout are intercepting your flies.
Hmm.
And I've talked about this concept of current interceptors and pool prowlers in the past. And interceptors, the bites happen really fast, and you need to be setting the hook really fast in time with those strikes to hook those fish. But the deeper water bites and a fish that's like a pool prowler that's going to take more time to look at the food, those are the types of fish that you need to get a natural sink rate and a natural drift with the current to get those fish to eat your flies. So those are the types of fish that are not right in faster water looking to intercept the fly, but are going to be able to look at it for a little bit longer in the types of water that they're holding in. Those fish are the fish that I think that the style of rigging that I'm going to describe as drift nymphing are most applicable to.
So we want to get right into that with how your leader's built for drift style nymphing or drift nymphing.
Well, I have the crayfish fly is a very popular, nymph that in the United States that a lot of people use on the Euro rods. And I get a lot of questions through direct messages where people ask me about what's the best way to rig that fly and present that fly. So here's a little bit of a visual reference to that. I have a little bit of a complex tapered leader here that represents the way that I would rig up and fish with a crayfish fly. And just to show kind of how many parts and steps there are to this leader. So in this leader, I have some 12-pound test Maxima chameleon, and there's enough of that in the back that's kind of the line that I would be handling. That is taking the place of a fly line in this rig for me to fish the crayfish. But that 12-pound Maxima chameleon has a pretty good amount of stiffness and integrity that allows me to handle it pretty easily. It doesn't get caught in the reel very easily. It's durable. If it gets, pinched or stepped on, that 12-pound is very unlikely to break. And so I've got 12-pound Maxima chameleon. And then what I have beyond this is all likely to be outside of my rod tip, between my rod tip and the fly. And there are knots. I know some people are very paranoid about having knots go through their leader. I have no concern personally about having knots go through my guides. And the knot that I like to tie is a back-to-back uni knot. And if you close that down nice and firm, it's a barrel-shaped knot that if you trim that tight, it's unlikely to slip, it's unlikely to catch in your guides. So that's what I choose to use when I build these leaders that have a bunch of knots. They're all going to be a back-to-back. It's either 3 turn on 3 turn, or 3 turns with the heavier material and 4 turns with the lighter material to make that barrel shape. So here in the back, I've got 12 pound to 10 pound Maxima Chameleon. And then from that 10, I'm going to a piece of cider material. And this cider material is a nice stiff material. This is a sample material that I have, but it's about 12 thousandths. And you'll see a nice smooth energy transfer from that 10 pound to the cider material. And then that cider material is going to go into an 8 pound Sunline FC Sniper. And again, a nice smooth energy transfer. And it's important that there's no part in the leader, for the way that I like to rig, that there's uh, a lack of energy where you go from one material to something that's very slack or limp. And so, more important than what the diameters are for the transfer is how stiff the materials are, because the leader that I'm showing in my hand right now is not a perfect transfer of diameters if you were measuring it with
Mhm.
a micrometer and looking at that on paper. But as I show you the flex in my hand, you'll see those nice smooth bends where there's not a gap in the flexibility and the stiffness of the material. And that allows me to hold the line off the water and have a smooth, gentle transition in the taper to be able to get visual strike detection, and also just control what the fly is doing as it moves down into the water at a whole bunch of different depths. Because if you have a nice taper, you can fish shallower water and deeper water. And although your strike indicator might be further out of the water or all the way down to the water, the way that your fly moves into the water is going to be a nice gradual progression of how it sinks. And you have to keep in mind that the leader is going to get pushed around by the hydrodynamics of the water. And the water at the surface where the meniscus is moving fastest, and the water down towards the bottom where there are rocks and there's turbulence that kind of knocks the water around and slows it down. The water is slowest at the bottom and fastest up at the surface. And the difference in those speeds is not always the same, because if the bottom is smooth, like it's all sand, the current is going to push right through there, and the current on the bottom will be closer to that of the surface. But if the bottom has boulders and angular obstructions, that's really going to create turbulence with the water. Then the water down at the near the bottom is going to be much slower and also swirling around more than the water up at the surface that's going to be moving in a more straight direction. The water up at the surface moving in a straight direction downstream is going to have the most surface tension. It's going to have the most resistance with the line. And so I intentionally want to build a leader that's going to have more resistance at the surface where the current is pushing it downstream than I have down deeper in the water where the fly is going to be. That's going to help create a natural movement of drift, pulling the fly downstream without me needing to unnaturally manipulate the fly and drag it through the water column. Because anytime you're really coming tight to the fly in deeper water, it is a in deeper water where the fish have a longer time to look at the flies. They don't have this small, tight vision window where they're intercepting flies, where you can move your fly around, and then a couple feet later in the current, the fish might not have seen what just happened with how you manipulated the fly. In deeper water where fish have a longer time to look at the flies, if you make any unnatural movements to set the fly up, the fish are going to see that while they're processing what the fly is doing, and oftentimes they're going to turn off on that. So setting up a leader that allows the fly to drift into the water column on its own and to work together with you, where the dynamics of the current are going to help keep your line tight without making it unnatural. That's where having a taper comes into play, that allows you to create a semi-taut presentation that fishes the fly well on the drop, kind of like a pendulum drop, and lets a fly that has a gravity and a mass that's similar to the natural food item to move down through the water the way something really would. If you took, say, a natural crayfish and threw it out into the water, the fish would see it gently, sink at a certain rate all the way down to the bottom, and it would never kind of jerk around or reset. So the deeper the water is, the harder it would be to create a presentation where that naturally happens. And the current up on the surface helps keep your line pulling forward, where you have more diameter up on the surface, so you can kind of not need to manipulate the fly and let the sink rate and the current do the work for you and just detect the strikes. So this is where using the European nymphing strike detection that a lot of people have developed from using thinner leaders comes into play. But with the right style leader, taper, and setup, you can fish flies that are going to move naturally with the current and have a more natural sink rate. And you can fish them in a wider range of depths effectively. So I was describing this taper here before, and I had 12-pound maxima, 10-pound maxima, chameleon, and then I have my 12,000th piece of indicator mono. And these are all shorter pieces. I usually use about 30 inches of indicator mono, and the length that I use of the 10 and the line going down to the fly are all variables that I manipulate to reflect what the conditions are. So this is going from that 12 thousandths to an 8-pound, a 7-pound, and a 6-pound of Sunline Sniper fluorocarbon, and then I have my crayfish fly. And the thing about the fly weights and the weight of something like a crayfish is it's a relative thing. I recently did an interview that someone ended up not showing the interview afterward, and one of the questions they asked me was, "What is the weight of your crayfish fly in centigrams?" And the answer is, it really doesn't matter what the weight of the fly is in centigrams or grams or whatever you weigh the fly in, because the relationship that matters is the volume to weight ratio. The density of the overall fly is going to determine how that fly is going to sink, what the rate it's going to sink at, and how much the hydrodynamics of the current are going to move the fly around and affect that sink rate. Because when you have legs and things on a fly, the current pushes it around in a way, where when you get down near the bottom and you have places where the current has hit rocks and the current is moving around, your fly doesn't sink in a linear way. And so when we try to defeat that by using a fly that, is extra dense, like a perdigon, down when a fish sees those in those places where they can see the fly for a long time, that fly that is not manipulated by the current looks unnatural. And those food sources that are the bigger ones are the ones that really have, legs and arms, and the fish and get pushed around by the movements of the current in the water. And all of that it's a hard thing to control, and we can't control it. But what we can do is we can use a taper so that we can let the fly that has a natural sink rate do its thing and show the fish that sort of drift, and be able to get a strike detection by feel or visually if a fish pounces on that fly that has the legs and arms and flowing parts of it. So for any given fly you have that's a weighted fly that has extra things coming off of it, it's a complex relationship of the of the mass and the surface area of the fly and the weight you have on there, that if you're in an environment where there's depth, but there's not turbulence, you're going to be able to have a more predictable sink rate of what that fly is going to do. But in places where you have turbulence down in the water column, from drift to drift, your cast can do different things. One drift, the current might pull it deeper, and one drift, the current might pull it higher. It's something that you need to work with if you're going to use big natural flies, that instead of trying to defeat that, I think that the play is that's part of just drift nymphing, is letting the current move your flies the way that they do through the water, and trying to create a drift of landing your fly in the right place and having a fly that has that natural sink rate where the current is going to bring it to the fish in a natural way, as opposed to kind of manipulating and steering and checking your line forward so you're tight with your fly, letting the fly do its thing. That's the drift nymphing concept.
So how does your cast and your initial placement affect that drift and hole? How important is it to get a to know where you are when you're casting?
And that's the magic of fly fishing,
Yeah.
I think, is understanding how the current is manipulating what your fly is doing as it moves through it. So when we use a strike indicator, we have some, unnatural way of seeing what's going on. And using a sighter is something of using a strike indicator that's giving you an idea of, where your line is, or using bright visible line. I like to use the chameleon because it's a darker line. And this is, I have a reel set up with bright green line on it for steelhead in front of me that I'm demonstrating with. But on my trout reels, I have a layer of chameleon where the reel surface is dark. So I don't have that bright band of
Mm,
line moving around as I'm approaching fish. And I've seen that spook fish.
yeah.
And I know that when I'm wearing all camouflage and I see myself in the reflection of my car holding my rod and I've got bright orange line on my spool, that's the most visible thing that's on my person
Yeah.
as I'm approaching the water. And that's also oftentimes out in front of you and moving around. So that's the reason that I use the chameleon and not a bright line when I'm doing trout fishing in visible areas. And sometimes, you're fishing in places where that's not a factor, in high, dirty water. And I do have reels rigged up with more visible lines. And when I think that it doesn't matter, I do like to be able to see all of my line up to my leader and not just that sighter. So that is a difference. This is kind of my stealthier trout rig to be using the chameleon on the line. But where we live here in Vermont, I'm fishing for wild fish. There's not that many of them. Oftentimes, from year to year, when I catch one, it's a fish that I caught the previous year, so I know that there's not that many of them. So little factors like that with fish that have had the experiences of you physically catching them previously, you know that those fish are having those experiences. So little things can count with what helps you get a very stealthy approach.
Those little things that count. So where in this setup are you modifying while you're out there to be more effective? Is it the top diameter affecting the drag, or is it diameter under the sighter?
Where I'm manipulating is under the cider.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, what I'm describing to you here is I'll have 12 pound. I'm going to have 10, or I'm going to have 10 and 8 before the cider, depending on the sizes that I'm using. This is a rig for fishing bigger flies where I've got 12 pound, 10 pound, a cider that I'm going 8, 7, 6 uh, below that. But either way, where I'm rigged up, I'm going to choose one setup of mono down to the cider, and then below the cider, that's where I'm going to make my adjustments. And it's oftentimes the bottom two parts of that cider. My strategy, if I'm using, say, a 30-inch cider, is I'll oftentimes have my first piece of a 3-part taper below the cider be about the same length of the cider. And I can cut into that a little bit where I make a few adjustments with some barrel knots, making that uni knot. But if I have 30 inches of that cider, that's about 10-pound test class, and it depends more on the stiffness of it at that point in the leader than it does the diameter or the breaking point. Once I go from that down into my taper, I'm gonna have the same length of that. Here it's gonna be 8 pound. Then that 7 and the 6 down to the fly, or sometimes it could be 765, or I might go from the 8 to 6 to 5. All of those things I am adjusting based on my fly size and sink rate, and then the depth of the water and the current turbulence of the water. The more turbulent the water is, the thinner I'm going to go down at the bottom to not let that push the fly around as much. But I'm still going to keep that taper above it to be able to control what's in my hand. And also having that taper, even though it is still mono, going from 12-pound test down to about 6 or 5 pound test, that taper range allows me to turn over, cast, and control those flies. And really, I've never broken a rod hitting it with a weighted jig. And people oftentimes see my flies and they're like, oh, wow, that must be really, you know, dangerous for your equipment to be casting those around. But using the right leaders and using that taper really helps you control what you do with a weighted fly. So to be able to pick those flies up and to turn them over with what for me feels like a leader turnover that you have when you have a fly line, when you have that good taper build and there's no kind of area where you have, say, a really slack cider material or something that doesn't carry the energy transfer. I feel like I'm able to get a turnover with the fly and be more precise with where the fly is, and also at distance be able to take a pretty big or heavy fly and have full control of how it lands and sets up drifting down into the water with that taper. So a lot goes into making the taper, and it's a complex thing, but for me that's one of the most satisfying parts of fly fishing, is to be able to manipulate that taper to work together with the fly and the stream environment to get that optimal drift that allows the fly to drift into the water, just like if you took a real natural food item and tossed it out there and let it drift into the current, and then get the strike detection from a fish that bites that fly with full gusto and confidence, because it's, it really looks like a thing and is the right, spot and place and presentation for the fish to feel good about biting it hard and giving me that easy strike detection, and to get the feeling that you've really tricked the fish, as opposed to being in fast water and having, maybe a blue colored perdigon, and the trout will bite pieces of wood and things that are in their drift and spit them out, because fish that are really actively feeding trout are in that mode and they can reject things, and we can catch them on things that they would reject a moment later because it's not a real food item. But for me, using those flies that have, like Kelly Galloup would say, the fly with soul, and trying to design flies that really imitate a food item and get the weight and the presentation and the body language and the movement of the fly right in the water to trick those fish, and to get a really full confidence bite where you can not just detect it visually, but detect it by feel. That's the thing that is most satisfying for me in the nymph fishing. And for me, that's the drift style of nymphing.
So you'd say drift style is kind of like nymphing with soul. So you're using the the actual stream and how the stream moves, and you're working with that instead of fighting against it in your drift.
Yeah, when you're using flies that the current can push around and you're building tapers that work together with the current, then I think that you've taken the style of nymphing that some people are starting to, feel like it's just like spin fishing, and you're keeping it in this dynamic, engaged style that for me really feels like fly fishing.
And it feels like it's more effective for you too. You're finding more fish in deep water with a tapered technique like this.
I wouldn't say that this is necessarily more effective than the style of just, you can catch more fish. I'm going to say this is less effective. You
Yeah.
can catch more fish if you're trying to catch the maximum number of fish that are biting. This is more a way to catch the big fish, to catch the really difficult wild fish. And it's a more, they're both a distinct skill. It's an incredible skill for people to be able to control tiny flies on light leaders and get really good visual strike detection. I have that skill too. I think that that is a its own thing. That is European nymphing done at the optimal level.
Mhm.
But for me, this is a different thing, and it is a little bit more of a challenge to try to get the tapers right to make the flies drift naturally as opposed to just using a really thin leader and cutting through it. But I think that there's a time and place where this is more effective, for those big fish, deep water situations. And I think that's a nice thing for the nymph fishermen to have both of those styles in their bag, to have that tight line, fine leader, micro leader style of visual strike detection, and then to have the heavier tapered style for bigger flies like jig streamers or the really big anchor flies. And that's that drift style nymphing.